Clint Eastwood's last fight for justice, story of courage and power. The town had always been quiet, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, and the biggest scandal was the occasional argument at the town hall meeting. It was a place where life moved at a steady, predictable rhythm until the day Sarah Thompson knocked on Clint Eastwood's door. Clint, now 93, lived in a modest ranch-style home on the outskirts of town, far removed from the Hollywood spotlight. His days were simple, reading the morning paper on his porch, walking to the local diner for coffee, nodding to the familiar faces who still saw him as a legend. He had earned his peace, and he intended to keep it. But the look in Sarah's eyes told him that peace was no longer an option. She stood there, hands trembling, clutching a folder thick with documents. Her gray hair was tied back in a loose bun, and exhaustion lined her face. Sarah had been a strong woman once. He remembered her from years ago, when she and her husband, Richard, ran the town hardware store. But now, she looked like a woman who had been fighting a battle she knew she couldn't win. "They killed him, Clint." Her voice was raw, heavy with grief. "And they're going to get away with it." Clint didn't speak at first. He simply held her gaze, reading between the lines of her words, seeing the weight of the injustice that had hollowed her out. "Come inside," he said. She hesitated, then stepped in, sinking into the old leather chair in his living room. For the next hour, Sarah told him everything. Richard had gone in for a routine heart procedure at the town's only hospital. The surgery had gone well, or so they had been told. But within hours, Richard had developed complications. The doctors dismissed Sarah's concerns, insisting it was normal. By morning, he was dead. At first, Sarah had accepted their explanation. People died, especially at their age. But then she started asking questions. She requested medical records. She reached out to other families who had lost loved ones at the same hospital. And what she uncovered was something far more sinister. Mistakes had been made, serious, avoidable mistakes. Tests ignored. Warnings unheeded. Doctors covering for each other. And when nurses had tried to speak up, they had been silenced. Fired. Threatened. She had hired lawyers, but every lawsuit had been dismissed before it could even reach a courtroom. Every door she knocked on was shut in her face. "No one will help me," she whispered, staring at the floor. "No one will fight them. I don't have the money. I don't have the power." She finally lifted her gaze to meet his. "But you do." Clint leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. There was a time when he wouldn't have hesitated. When the idea of taking on a corrupt system would have set his blood on fire. But that time had passed, hadn't it? He wasn't the man he used to be. "You still think I can do something about this?" His voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it, like a knife that hadn't lost its edge. "I don't think," Sarah said. "I know." For the first time in years, Clint felt something stir in his gut. A familiar itch. Justice had always been a fight worth taking. Maybe it still was. Clint sat in silence long after Sarah had left, staring at the thick folder she had placed on his coffee table. The weight of it, both physical and moral, pressed against him. He had spent decades playing the part of the man who stood up for justice, the lone gunslinger, the lawman who didn't back down. But that was just the movies. Real life wasn't scripted. Real life had consequences. He should have left it alone. He could have pretended he hadn't heard her, gone back to his morning coffee, and let someone else fight this battle. But as the sun set outside his window, the old itch wouldn't leave him. So Clint Eastwood did what he always did when something didn't sit right. He started asking questions. The next morning, Clint made his way down Main Street, stopping at the diner where half the town gathered before noon. The place was buzzing with conversation, the scent of bacon and coffee thick in the air. People nodded to him as he entered, but as soon as he sat at the counter, he noticed something: whispers. Sideways glances. People knew. And people were scared. "Coffee?" The waitress, Linda, poured before he answered. She was in her 60s, had been serving food longer than she'd care to admit, and wasn't easily rattled. But today, there was hesitation in her movements. Clint stirred his coffee, watching her. How long's it been going on? Linda didn't pretend not to know what he meant. She sighed, setting down the pot. Long enough, she murmured, keeping her voice low. And no one's done a damn thing? You think no one's tried? Linda shook her head. People have asked questions, Clint. You know what happens? Their appointments get canceled. Their prescriptions don't get refilled. And if they push harder, they lose their jobs. Small town like this, you cross the wrong people, suddenly you're packing up and leaving. Clint took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the bitterness settle. He wasn't surprised, but he was angry. He leaned in. You know something, Linda. What is it? She hesitated, but after a lifetime of knowing Clint Eastwood, she finally sighed and gave in. It's the hospital administrator, William Garrick. He runs that place like his own personal kingdom. Doctors do what he says, or they don't work. Nurses speak up, and they're replaced. The ones who stay, she trailed off, shaking her head. They keep quiet. Clint nodded. He had his first lead. Walking through the hospital doors, Clint felt like he had stepped onto a different battlefield. The air was sterile, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, but beneath the surface, there was a tension that reminded him of places he'd been where people feared speaking their minds. He went straight to the reception desk. I need to see William Garrick. The young woman behind the desk blinked up at him. Do you have an appointment? Clint let the silence stretch just long enough to make her nervous. Tell him Clint Eastwood's here. That did the trick. 10 minutes later, he was sitting across from Garrick in his plush office, the administrator smiling the kind of smile Clint had seen on too many men who thought power made them untouchable. I have to say, I didn't expect Clint Eastwood to walk into my office today, Garrick said, leaning back. Big fan of your work. Clint wasn't here for pleasantries. I want to talk about Richard Thompson. Garrick's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. A tragedy, truly. But I fail to see how it concerns you. Clint folded his arms. A good man died. And from what I hear, he wasn't the first. Garrick leaned forward, lowering his voice. Let me save you some time, Mr. Eastwood. People die in hospitals. Every day. If we examined every single case where a family wanted to blame someone, we'd never get anything done. Clint studied him for a long moment. You cover up mistakes. Garrick chuckled. I protect this hospital. And let me give you a bit of advice, you're old, Clint. Enjoy your retirement. Don't go sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Clint didn't move. He just stared, letting the silence stretch. Letting Garrick feel the weight of it. Then he stood. I don't take advice from men who are afraid of the truth. And with that, he walked out. Clint spent the next few days talking to people, nurses, orderlies, even a doctor who had moved out of town. They all told the same story. Garrick had built a system where speaking up meant losing everything. He controlled the board, had friends in high places, and played dirty. But people were tired. They were scared. And they wanted change. Clint had seen this before. Fear had a grip on this town. But fear only worked until someone stood up. So Clint Eastwood, at 93 years old, made a decision. He wasn't going to sit this one out. He was going to take on the most powerful man in town. And he wasn't going to do it alone. The town was waking up to something it hadn't felt in years, hope. It started as whispers, then quiet conversations behind closed doors, and soon, it was out in the open. People were talking. About Richard Thompson. About the hospital. About the man who was finally standing up to William Garrick. And Clint? He wasn't done yet. If there was one thing he knew, it was that power only feared one thing, numbers. Alone, one voice could be silenced. But an entire town? That was a different story. So he went to work. The senior center was packed, the musty scent of old books and fresh coffee lingering in the air. Most of the people in this room had lived long enough to know how the world worked. They had been ignored, dismissed, treated like relics of the past. But today, Clint Eastwood stood before them, and they were listening. "You've spent your whole lives building this town," Clint said, his voice low but steady. "You built the businesses. You raised the families. And now, when you need this place the most, they treat you like you don't matter." There were nods. A few murmurs. "You all know someone," Clint continued. "Someone who went into that hospital and never came out. Someone who should still be here. They think you're too old, too tired to fight back. They think you'll just accept it." Silence. Then a voice. "They're wrong." It was Robert Daniels, an 85-year-old retired school principal, his cane tapping against the floor as he struggled to his feet. "My wife died in that hospital 3 years ago. I never questioned it. Maybe I should have." Another voice. Then another. Until the room was buzzing with something that had been missing for too long: determination. A week later, the video went online. It wasn't flashy. No music, no dramatic editing. Just Clint, sitting in his chair, looking directly into the camera. "This isn't about one man," he said. "It's about a system that thinks you don't matter. A system that values profits over lives. It's about every family that's been told we're sorry for your loss when the truth is, their loss never should have happened." He named names. He called out Garrick. He called out the board. He told people to share their stories. And they did. By the end of the week, the town's social media was flooded with testimonies. Stories of misdiagnosis, negligence, loved ones lost too soon. National news picked it up next. And suddenly, the hospital wasn't just a local scandal. It was a nationwide disgrace. Garrick wasn't stupid. He had built his power on fear, and he knew exactly what to do when someone became a threat. The smear campaign started fast. Clint was painted as a senile old man, desperate for attention. The hospital released a statement calling the accusations unfounded conspiracy theories. A local newspaper, one that had always seemed a little too friendly with Garrick, ran an editorial about reckless fearmongering. And then there were the threats. It started with phone calls. "You don't know what you're getting into. Walk away while you still can." Then it escalated. Clint's mailbox was smashed in. His tires were slashed. And one night, as he sat on his porch, a black SUV rolled slowly down his street, headlights off. Watching. Waiting. But Clint didn't scare easy. So when they thought intimidation would shut him up, they forgot one thing. He wasn't alone anymore. The next town hall meeting was standing room only. People who had never spoken up before stood at the microphone, demanding answers. Nurses who had been silenced came forward, sharing the truth about the pressure they had been under. Families shared their grief. And in the middle of it all, Clint sat back and watched. The town had found its voice. Garrick had controlled this place for years. But now, he was sweating. And Clint Eastwood wasn't done yet. The storm had arrived. The town wasn't whispering anymore. It was roaring. The hospital was under siege, not with torches and pitchforks, but with voices. Citizens, once too afraid to speak, were now flooding social media, calling their representatives, showing up at the hospital demanding answers. What had once been the silent suffering of a few had become the collective rage of an entire community. And at the center of it all was Clint Eastwood. He hadn't planned to become the town's leader. He never wanted to be in front of a camera or have his name on the news again. But justice had a way of finding the right man for the job. And Clint, old as he was, knew he couldn't walk away now. Not when the battle was just getting started. It was late evening when Clint walked into the hospital's boardroom, uninvited but unavoidable. A dozen men and women sat around a polished oak table, their suits crisp, their faces tense. At the head of the table sat William Garrick, his smile thinner than ever. "You're causing quite a mess, Mr. Eastwood," Garrick said, tapping his fingers against the table. "I hope you realize that." Clint pulled out a chair, sitting down like he belonged there. He took his time, adjusting his jacket, leaning forward just enough to make them uncomfortable. "I've seen messes before," Clint said. "This ain't one of them. This is cleanup." The air in the room thickened. One of the board members, a balding man with an expensive watch, cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, we understand that emotions are high, but medical decisions are complex. You're creating unnecessary hysteria." Clint tilted his head, eyes sharp. "Is that what you call it when people die and you cover it up? Hysteria?" A younger woman at the end of the table, a lawyer, from the way she held herself, spoke up. "Legally, the hospital has done nothing wrong. The courts have dismissed every case." Clint nodded, slow and deliberate. "You're right. The courts threw them out. And why is that?" Silence. Clint let it stretch. He wanted them to feel it. "I'll tell you why," he said finally. "Because you made sure of it. You have judges in your pocket. You have state officials looking the other way. You have lawyers who know how to bury the truth under a pile of paperwork." More silence. Then Garrick leaned forward, his voice colder. "You think you're going to win this, Clint?" He shook his head, almost amused. "You're an old man clinging to a world that doesn't exist anymore. You may have some noise behind you, but noise dies down. People move on. They always do." Clint studied him for a long moment. Then, ever so slightly, he smiled. "Not this time." Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. Because he knew something Garrick didn't. This time, people weren't moving on. This time, they were just getting started. The first real crack in Garrick's wall came 2 days later. A nurse, one of the few who had worked at the hospital for over 2 decades, came forward. She went on record. Told the world about the intimidation, the falsified reports, the patients who had died because profit was more important than care. And once she spoke, others followed. A doctor. Then 2 more. Then an administrator who had been fired years ago but still had emails, documents, proof. News stations descended on the town. Investigators showed up with subpoenas. And then, the final blow, state auditors launched a formal probe into the hospital's finances. Garrick's empire was crumbling. And Clint? He wasn't done yet. Late one evening, Clint found himself back at the hospital, standing outside Garrick's office. The door was open, the room dimly lit, but Garrick was still inside. Sitting at his desk. Looking, for the first time, like a man who knew he had lost. Clint stepped in. "Hell of a week you're having." Garrick didn't look up. "I should have shut you down when I had the chance." Clint smirked. "Yeah. You should have." Garrick exhaled, leaning back. "I'll fight the charges. I'll drag this through the courts for years." Clint stepped closer. "Maybe. But you won't win." For the first time, Garrick looked at him. And Clint saw it, the fear. Not of Clint, not even of the law. But of irrelevance. Of losing everything. Clint leaned in. "Resign. Walk away. Because if you don't, they're coming for you. And this town? This town is gonna make damn sure you get what's coming." A long silence. Then Garrick's jaw clenched. "Go to hell." Clint chuckled, turning for the door. "You first." The next morning, Garrick resigned. By the end of the month, he was indicted on fraud and negligence charges. The hospital board was forced to step down. Families who had lost loved ones finally had their day in court. And the town? It had changed. People didn't look away anymore. They didn't whisper. They spoke up. They fought back. And Clint Eastwood, at 93, sat back on his porch, sipping his coffee, knowing he had done what he was meant to do. Justice wasn't just for the young. Justice had no age. The town had never seen anything like it. William Garrick was gone. His resignation had been forced out in disgrace, but that wasn't the end of his troubles. When the state investigators finished their review, they found evidence of fraud, negligence, and obstruction of justice, enough to bring criminal charges. The hospital board collapsed like a house of cards. One by one, those who had helped cover up the scandal were either fired or forced to step down. New leadership was brought in, and with it, long overdue reforms. For the first time in years, people walked into the hospital without fear. But this wasn't just about one hospital. The shockwaves from Clint's crusade spread beyond their quiet town. The media had turned his fight into a national conversation about corruption, about accountability, about the idea that just because a system had power didn't mean it was untouchable. And the town? It had learned something, too. Fear had ruled them for so long, but fear only works until someone stands up. And when they did, when they finally found their voices, power had no choice but to listen. It was a week after Garrick's resignation when Sarah Thompson showed up at Clint's house again. This time, she wasn't trembling. She wasn't clutching papers like a desperate woman grasping for hope. She was smiling. She carried with her a framed photograph, Richard, standing in front of their hardware store, grinning, alive in a way that Clint knew she wanted to remember. She set it down on his porch table, next to the morning paper. "You did it, Clint." Clint glanced at the photo, then back at her. He shook his head slightly. "We did it." Sarah sat down, exhaling deeply. "You know, I thought winning would feel different." "How so?" "I thought it would take away the grief. That maybe, if I got justice, it would stop hurting." She looked down at the photo of Richard, running her fingers over the glass. "But it still hurts." Clint nodded, understanding in a way that only someone who had seen too much of life could. Justice doesn't erase the past, but it makes sure it doesn't happen again. Sarah wiped a tear away, then smiled at him. "You ever think about running for mayor?" Clint let out a dry chuckle. "I think I've done enough paperwork for one lifetime." They sat in silence for a while, the warm sun casting long shadows across the porch. Then Sarah sighed, stretching her arms. "So, what are you going to do now?" Clint picked up his coffee, took a slow sip. "Same thing I do every morning." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Clint leaned back in his chair, letting the morning breeze rustle through the leaves. "Enjoy the peace." A month later, Clint recorded one final video. It wasn't about Garrick. It wasn't about the hospital. It wasn't about corruption. It was about people. He sat in front of the camera, the same way he had the first time, and spoke directly to the world. "I never wanted to be a hero. I never wanted to be a leader. I just wanted to sit on my porch and drink my coffee in peace." A small smirk. But peace doesn't come when good people stay quiet. Peace doesn't come when we let fear decide what we do. Peace comes when we stand up for each other. He exhaled slowly, looking straight into the camera. "I don't care if you're 19 or 93. You're never too old to fight for what's right." A pause. Then the final words. "Justice has no age. And neither does your voice." The screen faded to black. The town moved forward. New doctors came in. New policies were put in place. The people knew better now. They had seen their power, and they weren't going to let it be taken from them again. Clint? He went back to his quiet life. Mornings on the porch. Coffee at the diner. Nods from neighbors who now saw him as more than a legend on a movie screen. Because Clint Eastwood hadn't just fought for justice. He had reminded them that they were never powerless. And that was a fight worth winning. Clint Eastwood's story reminds us that justice has no expiration date and that our voices remain powerful, no matter our age. Too often, society dismisses older generations, assuming their time for influence has passed. But Clint's fight proves otherwise. He didn't act for recognition, he acted because it was right. And in doing so, he inspired an entire town to stand up. His journey teaches us that silence enables corruption, but courage, even in the face of fear, can spark change. Whether it's speaking out against injustice, mentoring younger generations, or simply refusing to be ignored, our wisdom and experience are invaluable. We've lived through wars, social upheavals, and moments that shaped history. Why should we stop now? The fight for fairness isn't just for the young, it's for all of us. If we see something wrong, we have a duty to say something, do something, be something. Because when we refuse to back down, we remind the world of a simple truth: justice isn't just for the strong, the rich, or the young. It's for everyone. And sometimes, it takes those who have seen the most to lead the fight that matters most.